individuals. Sorry, I just got interrupted there. The path that some individuals with disabilities need to take. With understanding, we hope it will lead to a world more accessible. My name is Sherry Roberts, and I work for the Independent Living Center as a community resource coordinator. And today I'm your host. For today's webinar, we will all look at accessible workplaces. But before we begin, the spirit of this event is an opportunity for learning. Our panelists will be sharing personal experiences and perspectives. This is their stories. They do not speak on behalf of all individuals living with disability. We encourage you to comment and ask questions to our panelists throughout this webinar, using the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. The last 10 to 15 minutes of our time together will be dedicated to answering your questions. Please remember to be appropriate and courteous. We are pleased to provide both CART transcription and interpretation services for today's webinar. To enable closed captioning, click on the closed caption button on the bottom of your Zoom window and then choose subtitles. To begin, I would like to introduce our moderator for today, Stacey Mitchell. Stacey has worked in several different roles within developmental services for over 25 years, the last 20 with KW Habilitation. She is currently the Manager of Community and Employment Supports, overseeing KW Career Compass and Leg Up. Developing community partnerships has been a foundation for her work in creating a diverse and inclusive workforce across KW. Over to you, Stacey.
Thank you, Sherry. Would you like to learn more about the value of diverse workplaces? Today, our panelists will have a discussion about workplace accessibility and accommodation, the legal rights and responsibilities of employers and employees, and myths about accommodations, and the value of employing people with disabilities. To begin, let's meet our guests. Here with us today is Brandon Cutler. Brandon was born with cerebral palsy. Growing up, he was very involved in sports, including track and field and wheelchair basketball. His involvement in sport helped instill a sense of self-confidence and helped him learn to focus on his abilities as opposed to his limitations. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Guelph and a postgraduate certificate in Human Resource Management from Sheridan College. When he was finishing school and considering career options, he was concerned that employers would not want to hire him because of his disability. He wants to encourage persons with disabilities to believe in themselves and know that there are opportunities out there. He now works as a human resources consultant with the federal government, and Brandon lives in Burlington with his wife and 2 adorable daughters. Also with us, Ashley Shaw is a master's candidate in the community psychology program at Wilfrid Laurier University, a library web accessibility advisor at Wilfrid Laurier University, a research associate with the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, and a board member of Braille Literacy Canada. She studies employment-related interventions for people who are blind and partially sighted, as well as a workplace inclusion strategies and metrics. She lives in Kitchener, Ontario with her husband and her 5-year-old guide dog. She loves dark roast coffee, science fiction books, and playing with the latest technology. Evon J. Gale is a labor and employment lawyer in Hicks Morley's Waterloo office. He advises private and public sector employers and management on a wide variety of issues involving labor, employment, human rights and accommodation, occupational health and safety, as well as workforce safety and insurance. Before attending law school, Evon received a Bachelor of Arts degree honors from York University with a concentration in human rights. So welcome to the panelists for today. And Evon, I think we're going to throw it over to you to start with some of that legal stuff.
Sure, thank you, Stacey. Hello, everyone tuning in. Let's just get right into it. One key piece of legislation that we all should be aware of is the AODA, that's the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And it has certain integrated accessibility standards which seek to identify, remove, and prevent barriers for people with disabilities in key areas of living. And now these standards apply to private and public sector organizations across Ontario with a goal to make Ontario accessible by 2025. And I think presentations such as this certainly aid us in that pursuit. The government is developing and enforcing 5 key standards, those being customer service, information and communication, employment, transportation, and built environment. I'll be discussing primarily employment right now. So the accessibility standard for
I just need to interrupt for 1 second. I'm so sorry. We just need to slow down a tiny bit for our interpreters. That's all. So we can just take a beat. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
No problem, and thank you for the note. So the accessibility standard for employment. Whether your organization is large or small, attracting every potential candidate for employment and customers is essential to your business. And being accessible to potential candidates, employees, customers, all of whom may have disabilities, isn't just the right thing to do, but it is also the law. The accessibility standard helps organizations make accessibility part of their procedure for finding, hiring, and supporting employees with disabilities. And employers must make their workplace and employment practices accessible to potential and current workers with disabilities. So we are going to discuss 4 employment standards, which typically apply to smaller businesses. There are additional ones which do apply to larger businesses. So first, recruitment, assessment, selection, and hiring. So as I stated, accessibility should be a normal part of the recruitment process. And this really begins with the job advertisement, the job posting. Employers must notify applicants that accommodation is available, including for the interview or initial assessment, and not just once they are employed. And a practical step employers can take to not just include accessibility as a normal part of recruitment, but really welcome and encourage applications from people with disabilities is to state just that on a job advertisement, right? You can be, of course, it can be catered to your specific workplace, but the job advertisement could say, insert employer name here, welcomes and encourages applications from people with disabilities. And something that I think, and I hope we all know, is that people with disabilities are severely underrepresented in the workforce. And adopting this kind of approach really allows employers to tap into that underutilized disabled employee pool. So now moving further, if requested, accommodation requires consultation with the worker. It's important that employers and potential candidates or potential applicants and workers engage in accommodation dialogue. And I'll touch more on that a little bit later. As it relates to recruitment and hiring, if the candidate is successful, they must be informed of the policies for accommodation. And employers should encourage applicants to make requests as soon as possible. This is really a proactive step that I think can save what could be a lot of trouble down the road for employers, and also make life easier for employees, as the employer would already be aware of what might be needed. A second employment standard is workplace information and communication supports. So workers may need information in accessible formats, such as accessible digital or large print version of documents. Other workers may need communication supports, such as sign language interpretation, thank you, or real-time captioning at meetings. Performance management. 3, employers must also ensure that their performance management and career development processes are accessible and considers the worker's disability. So workers should have access to documents, coaching, feedback, all in formats or environments that work best for them. So for example, a worker with a hearing disability may request to meet or to have their performance review done in a particularly quiet place. And lastly, communicating accessibility policies, including job accommodation. Employers must also notify employees of updates to such policies. And I think it's also prudent to have accommodation plans put in writing. This is so employers can head off accommodation requests and be proactive in that regard, particularly as it relates to the procedural duty to accommodate, which is more or less that accommodation dialogue I spoke of, which is the consultation back and forth between employee and employer. And lastly, before I pass it back to Stacey, compliance reports must be done every 3 years, and There is a deadline soon approaching, June 30th, 2021. So for any HR business people or employers watching now, our firm can help you navigate what could be a different accommodation plan. So thank you, Stacey. Back to you.
Thank you. Brandon, can I perhaps get you to expand a little bit more on that untapped labor pool?
Certainly. Thank you, Stacey, and thank you, Evon, for that background. So I think it goes without saying that organizations need talented people to help them grow and succeed. And something I'm very passionate about and want to emphasize today is what Evon touched on previously, the fact that persons with disabilities represent a large and relatively untapped talent pool for employers to draw from. And inclusive workplaces can represent a win-win scenario for both organizations as well as persons with disabilities. So if we look at some statistics, they'll show that persons with disabilities represent about 22% of the Canadian population aged 15 and older. And this is a very significant portion of Canadians of working age. And according to information from Employment and Social Development Canada, there are approximately 645,000 Canadians with disabilities who have the potential to work in an inclusive labor market and are not currently working. That's a massive talent pool of people that are available but not currently working. Many Canadians with disabilities are underemployed or unemployed. Sorry, unemployed or underemployed, meaning that they could have access to jobs which better utilize their skills and abilities if employers are willing to give them an opportunity to use those. Improving workplace access would allow 550,000 Canadians with disabilities to work more, and it would increase Canada's gross domestic product by $16.9 billion by 2030. To me, that speaks volumes to just how much of an opportunity we have here. So employers, persons with disabilities, and indeed Canada as a whole have a lot to gain from improving workplace inclusivity.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brandon. Sorry.
I just had one more point.
Yeah, absolutely.
An important part of inclusive hiring involves reconsidering the hiring process through an inclusive lens, including the application process and how employers view candidates' qualifications, such as the value of the different experience they can bring to the organization. Thanks, Stacey.
Thanks, Brandon. And that leads beautifully into what, Ashley, I know that you're quite excited about speaking in the narrative of that resume and the importance of that experience.
Yeah, thank you, Stacey, and thanks, Evon and Brandon. I think it's so important to consider, for all of us, so not just for workers with disabilities, but for all workers. Not all of our timelines and kind of life progressions look identical to one another. As we kind of go through our K-12 education into post-secondary education and beyond into work experience, different things can happen, right? So a more kind of mainstream example might be, if parents start a family and then one or both of them take parental leaves at different points in time, that can create some sort of gaps in their career experience or in their resume that are understood by all of us, because it's a common leave to require, it's a common experience for young families. And so for workers with disabilities, we just need to take that understanding a step further in thinking about how the way that we currently construct resumes might be privileging one set of experiences or situations or circumstances over others. So if you're at the stage where you've included that notice that Evon talked about around welcoming applications from candidates with disabilities and accommodating them in the hiring process. But if, for example, you at the same time have a recruitment system that focuses on a particular format of resume or a particular style of resume, that's very kind of focused around dates and what people have done at certain points in time, and on kind of capturing that work history in a particular way, you might be in a situation to wonder why you're not accessing this untapped hiring pool of people with disabilities that Brandon mentioned. And so I would invite all of us to consider different kind of styles of presentation when we're looking to hire people, and that can continue into the interview process as well with the types of questions that we ask, because your job candidates with disabilities might just have different work histories or different timelines, and sometimes one of the things that we tell job seekers when we're coaching them is think about all of that kind of experience that you have because of your lived experience of having a disability that's not necessarily being leveraged just because you don't have, you might not have a particularly strong work history. So there are a lot of system navigation skills, of problem solving skills, innovation strategies, collaboration skills, creativity, all of these skills and strategies that you're looking for in employees, that you might not be, able to kind of capture at a first glance if you're looking at someone's resume and if they don't have a lot of job experience. And I'm far from the only one to be thinking along these lines. So the discoverability tool, for example, utilized by the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, is one such tool, and they'll look at a candidate's work history along with kind of their aptitudes and their personality assessments and soft skills that they might have, and try to make to match those up with roles that employers are interested in hiring for, and employers can connect with that network if they're particularly interested in accessing that untapped talent pool for their organizations.
Thank you,
I
Ashley.
could, Stacey, just to parry with what Ashley just said, there's a lot of organizations, including community partners, that can help employers hire and retain employee or persons with disabilities. And these organizations work with employers, as Ashley's already mentioned, to understand their labor needs, to remove barriers by helping them to ensure that their recruitment process is inclusive, by providing training to the employer and the employees, and ultimately helping match employers with qualified candidates in their communities. So there are quite a few tools out there to assist.
Absolutely. And as an employee of one of those organizations, KW Habilitation would love to work with you. Cheap plug. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Ashley. I definitely, there's so much value in those transferable skills, and should not be overlooked, that those lived experience, those skills that transfer and translate definitely into employment. Brandon, I'm going to ask you a question maybe you could expand on. Are inclusive workplaces good for business?
Absolutely. Thanks, Stacey. So when it comes to inclusive workplaces, there are many different perspectives to examine this topic from. So on the one hand, you can see how creating an inclusive and accommodating workplace is the right thing to do. Another way to look at it is it's a legal requirement to do so. But I feel it's particularly important to highlight that statistics show that inclusive work environments are just plain good for business. So for example, information from Employment and Social Development Canada highlights that organizations with inclusive cultures are twice as likely to meet or exceed their financial targets. They're 3 times as likely to be high performing, 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile, and 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. And research also indicates that inclusive practices help to do the following. They help to foster innovation. They help to improve productivity, reduce turnover, enhance job performance and work quality. They help to attract the best and brightest employees to your organization, increase your company's morale, increase employee satisfaction and engagement, improve attendance, improve safety records, gain access to more diverse markets and customers. So while employers have a legal obligation to provide inclusive and accommodating workplaces, and it's very important that they meet those requirements, this can also be seen as a strategic investment that will benefit organizations over time. Thanks, Stacey.
Hi, Stacey. Sorry, just before you get started, just a reminder, Brandon, you did a great job. Your pace was wonderful, but everyone just needs to slow down just a tiny bit for our interpreters. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry, for that reminder. Evon, I think we are going to get you to expand a little bit further on those legal and financial benefits of hiring and having an inclusive workforce.
Sure. As Brandon mentioned, as I've stated, there are legal requirements that employers must have as it pertains to hiring, selection, and also policies within the workplace that apply to existing employees. But I'm in complete agreement with Brandon. I think, we know that people with disabilities are underrepresented in the workforce. And I think that, it's important to remember that we all have abilities. Some are just more apparent than others, but to be true, employees with disabilities often bring unique skills to the table, as Brandon has stated. And in my experience, I think employers take seriously their responsibility to include people with disabilities in the workforce, and are in fact eager to learn how they can do better. Great effort is put into accommodating existing employees who acquire disabilities. So I think the foundation of experience and understanding to be able to do that in hiring is also there. So there was one program which I discussed, which provides financial support and provides aid to employers seeking to hire individuals with disabilities. But there are also additional programs and also financial support for certain things. There is the Opportunities Fund for Persons with Disabilities, which is part of the Employment and Social Development Canada that Brandon touched on. And this is a program that supports persons with disabilities in overcoming barriers to participation in the Canadian labor market, and supports employers as well to hire persons with disabilities. And this program supports a wide range of programs and services, including job search supports, as we touched on, pre-employability services, wage subsidies, work placements, and employer awareness initiatives to encourage employers to hire a person with disabilities. There's also additional funding through the Enabling Accessibility Fund. This is more for construction projects, which to the end which we speak will permit employers to be more accessible both for their potential employees or potential applicants, employees, and customers all alike. There's a small project component, which is, I think, most relevant to our discussion here, which is based on workplace accessibility projects. So such as ramps, accessible doors, accessible washrooms, hearing loop systems, and also communication technology projects. And this fund could be up to $100,000. Funding is limited as subject to budget considerations, but it's extremely important to note that priority is given to workplace accessibility projects, that being projects that improve the accessibility and safety of persons with disabilities in facilities where they work or could work. And also priority is given to organizations that offer or will offer employment opportunities for persons with disabilities. And another funding project under the EAF, the Enabling Accessibility Fund, is for mid-sized projects. Now, these are generally on a larger scale, such as creating a whole hub or a center that offers programs and services for persons with disabilities. So to Brandon's point, just to back it up, it makes business sense. Research shows that inclusive workplaces do all those things that Brandon stated. And there are supports to aid employers in this pursuit. So I think to wrap up from a legal perspective, compliance is of course mandatory, but also from a business perspective, if you want to be looking at your bottom line, then there are a lot of ways that supporting inclusive businesses or supporting inclusive business practices will help grow your business, and there are funds that can assist you on that path.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so we're going to have a little bit of fun, and our panelists are going to dispel some myths. So I'm going to throw a myth out there, and you guys can decide, you can fight amongst yourselves of who wants to start dispelling it, okay? So we want to make the point that inclusivity makes business sense. So the myth, most employees with disabilities do not perform as well.
Well, I can start with this one. Just being management side labor and employment lawyer, I can confirm that poor performing employees come in all different shapes and sizes, and there's absolutely nothing specific about disabled employees which would hinder their performance if the right support is in place. And oftentimes those supports are not nearly as expensive as employers might think. And also they can be achieved just through accommodation dialogue. It's ensuring that you communicate with your employee to understand how you can best help them be the best employee they can be. And that really applies to all employees across a workforce.
If I could add something in response to that as well. One of the things to consider with all employees, not simply employees with disabilities, is kind of an idea we would think of as person environment fit. And so in the workplace, when we say that, we mean, does this employee have the tools and the correct environmental supports to do their job, most productively, most efficiently, to really contribute to their team in the best way possible. And so I find that a lot of issues around performance are not necessarily tied to the employee in particular, but can often be tied to environment person fit mismatches. And so often, whether someone has a disability or not, correcting for some of those mismatches and ensuring that people have the right environment and the right tools and the right resources to do their jobs is valuable. It enhances performance and morale and all of those important things.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley. Brandon, did you have anything to add to that particular myth?
Not really, but I can handle the next one if you like.
Excellent. I was going to throw it at you anyway.
Okay.
So the myth, most people with disabilities use wheelchairs.
Okay. So in terms of this myth, I mean, maybe employers might be thinking if most people with disabilities use wheelchairs, then to hire someone in a wheelchair could mean a costly accommodation or retrofit of their office, for example. So it could, perhaps if they're under that understanding, it might lead to some hesitancy on their part. But in fact, about only 1% of Canadians use wheelchairs, and to that point, pain, mobility, and flexibility limitations are the most common types of disabilities in Canada. So many disabilities are actually not visible at all. And while employees may require accommodation in the workplace, such measures are not necessarily overly costly. And this actually leads into the next myth that we're going to dispel.
Absolutely. So the next myth, Ashley or Evon, did you have anything else to add to dispelling that particular myth about most people with disabilities use wheelchairs? Did you have any other comments to that? No?
I think Brandon's covered it pretty well from my perspective.
For sure. Thank you. So the next one then, Brandon, as you said, it costs too much to adapt the workplace for an employee with a disability.
I can start. Oh, sorry, Evon, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Brandon.
Okay, so this one in particular, I like to dispel this one, because in fact, 57% of employers spend nothing on workplace adaptations. And most workplace adaptations that are required are low or no cost at all. And so the most frequently required workplace adaptations are flexible work schedules, such as modified or reduced hours, that being 19% of accommodations fall within that. The next most common one is modified or different duties, just over 13% of accommodations falling within that category. And then finally, a special chair or back support, and just over 10% falling in that category. Evon, did you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah. I think a lot of those accommodations really apply just across the workforce broadly, right? Particularly as we're in a COVID world now, we're talking ergonomic, when we're talking ergonomic support. That's something that I think all employees are asking for, but as it pertains to the costly nature of employees, of accommodations, I think the thought that people needing accommodations is too costly or may constitute undue hardship, which is the legal term for when accommodation costs too much, or is believed to cost too much, that may be rooted in the belief that such accommodating always requires specialized equipment or large-scale structural accommodations. As we've already touched on and Brandon debunked, wheelchair, specialized equipment such as wheelchairs really aren't the lion's share of accommodation requests. I think it always depends on the situation, of course, but in many cases, it's quite inexpensive to accommodate. It could be things such as widened doorways or accessible bathrooms, which I think are two accommodations that many employers have put in place to date. And as Brandon noted, these could also be altering work hours or job tax, or making minor inexpensive modifications to workstations. I think the key in this whole process really is that accommodation dialogue between employer and employees, ensuring that the employer asks questions to the employee to be able to assess and determine what supports they may need. That's what's called the procedural duty to accommodate, is that first or that communication, that consultation process. And then I think the Supreme Court has made quite clear that undue hardship arguments based on cost alone will be scrutinized very carefully or very critically. And I think one reason for that is because oftentimes they are quite inexpensive. So they should be able to be put in place, but of course that's a case by case scenario. But to quote the Supreme Court directly, I think these couple of sentences are quite powerful. They say, one must be wary of putting too low a value on accommodating the disabled. It is all too easy to cite increased cost as a reason for refusing to accord with the disabled equal treatment. And again, this is really on a case-by-case basis. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach, but it's engaging in that accommodation dialogue that's going to allow an employer to understand what supports might be needed and then quantify what that support might cost. Mere speculation, I think the court is quite clear that that won't be enough to fulfill the undue hardship portion of the accommodation analysis. You really need to understand in black and white in ink on paper what these accommodations may cost. And I think a lot of times, as we've talked about, these accommodations might surprise you how little they cost, or if they cost anything at all. But again, it's the accommodation dialogue that's really clear. But two things that I did want to point out is that employers certainly have a duty to engage with employees, engage in that accommodation dialogue to be able to understand what it is the employee needs. And need is a key word there, because from the employee side, it's important to understand that employees are not entitled to their preferred or perfect accommodation. What they are entitled to is a reasonable one. And a reasonable one, I think, oftentimes should, particularly for the larger scale businesses, be feasible. As you start to reduce the employee size and reduce the size of the business, those considerations might differ, but all in all, it's just engaging in that accommodation dialogue that will help, that really underlies this entire accommodation process.
For sure.
If I could
Ashley.
add to that a little bit. Yeah. So I first want to emphasize how important that accommodation dialogue that we've been talking about is. What it's important not to do is make an assumption at the stage when you're, in the recruitment process or you're interviewing a candidate, things like that, to make assumptions based on what you happen to perceive about that candidate's disability or what they might have disclosed to you. It's not, the employer is not the one who's qualified to decide what a candidate requires for an accommodation either. And in a lot of cases, that I've observed or that I've been personally involved with, employers might be making the situation worse in their mind than it actually is. And speaking with the employee about, what they need, for example. So my disability is visual impairment. I'm totally blind, and most employers know very little about assistive technologies, kind of what that means, what those are like, and how they function to help me do my job. And so, if an employer makes assumptions about, it being very complicated to accommodate me at work, and because they're not aware that assistive technologies exist, then there's going to be forever that communication gap between us, right? So, actually having a conversation with the candidate or with the new hire about, what's worked for them in the past. We're used to this. We've been dealing with this a while, especially if our, the onset of disability is not new. And a lot of times the candidate or the new hire can help the employer to learn about what's available and settle on something that's going to function for both of them. And I think the other thing to consider is that accommodations that we might consider, costly, can be avoided when we don't do things like retrofitting after the fact or sticking on kind of interim or band-aid solutions. So if we employ something like an inclusive or universal design process from the beginning, when we design an environment or a building or a website or a service or a product, designing for kind of an inclusive audience base is going to reduce the potential that we'll need to kind of retrofit with really complicated, expensive accommodations down the line. So it ends up, being a better long range plan. It's saves on resources, and it's once you get used to going through that process, it's very valuable.
Great, thank you. All right, next myth. Training employees with disabilities is too hard and expensive.
I can start on this one if you like.
Go for it, Brandon.
So the fact is that every employee, whether they have a disability or not, requires different amounts of time to learn new job responsibilities. And persons with disabilities don't take longer than anyone else to learn a new task.
Right on. Anybody else want to add to that?
I can add quickly. I think one of the wonderful things we've all been learning lately as we learn about more equitable and inclusive organizations and practices is just how many of us, regardless of whether we have a disability or not, use different learning modalities. And so by that I mean, some of us learn really well by learning together in kind of a pseudo classroom environment or a group environment. Some of us learn really well by reading instructions. Some of us learn well by watching a video, or maybe listening to a podcast and walking around. And so, employers and kind of organizations that assist with things like workplace training that incorporate some of those multiple learning designs and modalities, I think have an even better success, not just for their employees with disabilities, but for everyone, for every new hire in an organization or every person who's learning a new job.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I feel like we could go on all day dispelling myths because there's so many of them out there, but I really want to see if we can expand a little bit more. Ashley, you were talking about integration of inclusive design into policy and onboarding. Is there more that you can add to that? Because that for sure is a key area we want to make sure we touch on today.
For sure. It's so important because, again, it can save us so much time and energy in the long run, and it makes a better environment and a better organization and workplace and product for everyone. And so if you think about if you think about the majority of people, if you picture a kind of a normal distribution in your mind, to take you back to math class, if you picture that a lot of people are the majority of people being clustered close together in terms of their experiences, with minorities kind of being out around the edges or the tails of that distribution. What's clear is that if you design for that, that clustered experience in the middle, you're going to leave out a lot of those edges. You're going to leave out the experiences of people that get kind of pushed to the margins when we design around the majority experience. But if you start designing your policy or your environment, your workplace, your product from the outer edges of human experience, you will kind of encompass and embrace and grab everyone in the center through that process. So by kind of going around to the edges of human experience, you will actually design things that work better for everyone and that work better for kind of unanticipated and innovative cases that you haven't thought of. So a good example might be that initially we created text-to-speech software, and I'm using it at the moment to navigate my computer screen, and it's reading to me what's on the screen. But a while after such tools were created for people with disabilities, we developed things like the GPS unit that can, be installed in your car and that will read you directions as you're driving. And so lots of those, when those features first came out, a lot of that automated speech that you were hearing was not new at all to many of us who have disabilities and who had been using tools like that, in all parts of our lives before. And so by designing something for, a more kind of an edge experience, people were able to design something that was useful for everyone. And so this doesn't need to be a one-size-fits-all solution that you're creating. It just means designing using a flexible approach that can be customized or adjusted to suit individual needs. And so I'll kind of leave you with a couple different ideas to think about as you're designing anything in your workplace, from your onboarding to your flex time and flex place policies, to your return to office stuff during the pandemic, all those things. So think about who's there. Don't just assume that you know who's there. Think about who your workforce are, who your customers are, and what their needs might be. And if you're not sure, gain access to resources that will help you to learn more about those things. And consider that there might be unanticipated audiences. So, perhaps you don't, you don't think you have someone with a disability working for you right now, but you may next week or next month, or one of your current employees may acquire a disability. And as part of your project planning, be sure to include at which stages you'll be consulting or collaborating with your intended audience, to make sure that what you're designing is something that works for them. And I would also consider consulting with your audience or your kind of users, even at the stage where you're kind of defining what the problem is or what the project itself is going to be. And that's because, these users can help you to articulate what the problem you're trying to solve is and what potential solutions are that would work for everyone. And so there are lots of potential resources that you can look into to kind of get used to this process. OCAD University's Inclusive Design Research Center is the one I would most highly recommend. It's extremely excellent.
Thank you, Ashley. Before we move things back over to Sherry to look at the questions and answers, I just want to make sure, I know that there was a few other points about accommodations that we wanted to touch on. Evon, was there anything more? I know that you put a lot of that information into dispelling the myths there, but was there anything else that we missed around accommodations that we wanted to make sure we shared today?
Accommodation is such a nuanced area of law. It can be that there's so much tribunal jurisprudence out there detailing the process. I think the main takeaway, if any, is simply to consult, to speak, as we jam down your throats, accommodation dialogue. It really is a cornerstone, and I think also the foundation for being able to have the type of employee-employee relationship that I think all workplaces should strive for. You know, and to relay what Ashley said, I think doing this at the outset, at the beginning, in terms of soliciting advice, maybe right after hire, maybe shortly after hire, and not when something comes up, is a proactive approach that employers can employ to be able to meet the needs, not the wants, of their employees appropriately, and also, you know, be able to build the inclusive workspace that we're talking about. It really starts far before an accommodation is requested, far before the procedural duty to accommodate is in front of you. It's a proactive approach that I think will really lead to better solutions for everyone down the road.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really a lot of information, a lot of really great information. And Sherry, I know that you've got some questions that you want to throw at our panelists today.
I do. We have a few questions from our audience. So the first one is, what does the AODA have in place to ensure that employers are not allowed to prefer a job applicant who does not speak up about the need for accommodations during the hiring process over an equally qualified applicant who requires an accommodated hiring process? So I'm not sure who this would best go to, but somebody has an answer for that one.
I think I might be able to feel that one. Would you mind just repeating it one more time for me?
Sure. So essentially it's what does the AODA or legislation, I guess, in general have in place to ensure that employers aren't discriminating against a job applicant who requires accommodations during the hiring process, as opposed to, say, someone who maybe does need accommodations but doesn't disclose that during the hiring process, you know? So they're weighed unequally. And is there anything in the legislation to speak to that?
In terms of compliance, the AODA and the integrated sex, or the IAS does have certain obligations, certain compliance measures for employers. Those largely relate to the compliance reports and also being acting in accordance with the AODA. So this would be a situation potentially if there were something going on, but I think generally it's really on the employer to ask if accommodation is needed, but also, as we discussed, you know, individuals with disabilities know the accommodations that they need. So that whole scenario can kind of be headed off if in the application, and it should be in the application, that accommodations are available upon request for the interview process and through hiring. That is stated within the IAS, the integrated standards. So I think in terms of you know, penalizing, we may still be a ways away from there. I think the AODA really takes more of a nurturing approach when it comes to meeting the accessibility standards. So to that end, you know, there may not be type of answer that I think this individual might be looking for, but I do know that employers should be putting in their job applications, in their postings. Maybe it may not be an organizational fit to encourage, but certainly that there is accommodation available, and that should make any applicant with a disability feel comfortable in disclosing that to the employer upfront.
I would just add to that the other element we always have to think about in Ontario specifically is the Provincial Human Rights Code. And so for employers and employees, and particularly around kind of disability and accessibility, there are you know, pieces that connect with the what we call the Act, or like the AODA that Evon has been talking about, and then there are pieces that connect with the code, so the Ontario Human Rights Code as well. And so often if you know, it may be the case that if an employee or a candidate knows that they have been they've been discriminated against in the hiring or the recruitment process, they may have recourse through some of those measures. But I would just say that it's, the employer can do a lot to mitigate this process by welcoming everyone that they interview, not just people they perceive to have a disability or anything like that, but by welcoming all of their candidates to disclose and to talk about what they need, because many people, as this question seems to suggest, do feel concerned about what stage should I disclose, and what kind of ramifications will that have for me. So as employers, you can do a lot to mitigate those concerns for people, and let them know that you're happy to work with them.
Wonderful. I think sort of tying into that question, there's a follow-up question, which is, so it seems like it makes good ethical and financial sense to hire people with disabilities. What do you think some of the apprehensions are on behalf of the employers, that they're just still a little bit uneasy about it?
I can address this first, and then if the others of you, if you have comments. But one of the items that I hear about a lot is that employers are concerned that the person with a disability, they're concerned about the person's fit on their team or in kind of their organizational culture. And I would expand on the kind of this idea that everyone, regardless of whether they have a disability or not, has ability to impact organizational culture and team or work group culture for better or for worse, right? Because we're all different people, and people with disabilities are just a cross section of kind of every other group of folks in society. That being said, I think that kind of the innovation and the flexibility and the kind of empathy and creativity that can be brought to play as a team integrates with someone who has a disability, whether that's a new hire or someone who's acquired a disability, that is only going to make your team stronger. It's going to increase kind of the sense of belonging and of group ownership that your team has over its process. And so I would suggest that employers have had very good experiences in that regard, and it's not something to be reticent over.
Sherry, if I could just add to that as well. So I think it kind of ties back to some of the myths or misperceptions employers might have about hiring persons with disabilities. They might think it's going to end up being very costly, or it's going to hinder their organizational performance. And respectfully, I do appreciate that it's a complex process sometimes, the accommodation process, but I think it's a narrow view to look at it that way. We've been talking all day about the untapped potential of hiring persons with disabilities, and I think to look at it that way is just missing out on really the future of work and so many talented individuals that could be contributing to the success of the organization.
Wonderful. That's perfect answer. Thanks, guys. We have another question here. So I'm wondering about workload. I have a profound hearing loss and have been seconded in the education sector. I began in March. It takes me longer to read. I am doing very well in the role. It is different than being a teacher. People in management are super supportive. However, I feel embarrassed to ask for more time and often work longer hours than I need. Any advice? And they did follow up with they're finding it difficult how to articulate sort of their requirements, that they rely on live captioning, and that their role requires a significant amount of reading. So how would they, it sounds like, ask for more supports in that case, where it's taking them longer to fulfill the role because of their disability?
I would start off by saying that you're at a good start because you've already captured why it's taking you longer, and you're able to explain that it's because of the way that the accommodations piece together and work together that you need some extra time, and I think that's one of the things that's trickiest is people just might not understand, well, why are you not kind of doing this in the same way that everybody else is, and so I think that's an important start in the dialogue. And I'm assuming and kind of inferring from my own experiences of something similar that it does need to be a dialogue and a little bit of trial and error in situations like that. Because often, a situation is not just gonna, finger snap present itself. Often it does require kind of some back and forth of experimenting with, exactly how much you can get done in what time frame, and also of accounting for other things like your ability to be, the fact that if you're very detail oriented, if your work is highly accurate, and all of those sorts of things, those need to be accounted for alongside something like speed that we typically tend to talk about.
Okay, so I'm just being mindful of the time. The hour just flew by with this wonderful conversation we've had around accommodation in the workplace. So there are a couple of questions that were still out there. So I'm wondering if the participants would like us to reach out to them. Maybe we can connect one of you guys with these individuals if that works, if that's what they would prefer. If they can pop their email in the Q&A in the bottom, that would be great. But for now, I'm just going to have some closing remarks here, and then we will head off for our rest of our day. So thank you everyone for your participation today. We'd like to invite all of you to join us for the remainder of the week by visiting the registration page on the City Kitchener website. Tomorrow and Wednesday, we're going to take a look at the value of allyship in community and at work. Thursday, our speakers will talk about how to communicate with accessibility in mind. And on Friday, we're going to talk about the future of accessibility in technology. So many thanks to our organizing committee organizations that brought all of us together today, including the Independent Living Center of Waterloo Region, CNIB Foundation, CHS, Canadian Hearing Service, Community Support Connections, KW Accessibility, Bridges to Belonging, KW Habilitation, and the cities of Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge, who contributed towards our closed captioning, video relay service, and transcription services. I would also like to thank all of our panelists and our moderator for making today's webinar such a great success. And I hope everyone has a fabulous day. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's Ryan here. One more quick thing. We're just about to launch a quick 3-question poll. If you don't mind doing it, they're yes and no questions just right before you step out, and then you guys are free to go. So thank you. I will launch that now.
Thank you, Ryan.
I feel like I'm a little biased, but we're getting an excellent test.
Agreed. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.